Please welcome Jay Stringer.
Peter's introductions are always the best. Last time I was with us, there's a English crime fiction author by the name of Jay Stringer as well. So he was bringing me into all these dark sexual murders last year. So it is such a joy to be back with you all. Huge thanks to Paul for inviting me back. It's rare to be at an organization to talk about sexual brokenness, especially an organization that doesn't exist exclusively to meet that need. So, I mean, what you all are doing here to engage these things, to have dinners, to have meetings, you all are a rare organization from what I've seen around the country. So I am so, so grateful to be here. So the topic that we're going to be talking about today is unwanted sexual behavior. And essentially what that is any dimension of your sexual life that you would say at the end of the day is unwanted. That could be the use of pornography, that could be infidelity, buying sex. So what I wanted to kind of do, even with the title of this book, is to say I don't think that sex addiction applies to all of us. Some of us certainly, but at the end of the day, I think what we can all join in is that there are particular aspects of our sexual behavior and sexual fantasies that at the end of the day, we wish were not there. And so what I love about the New Canaan Society is that you all are unafraid of talking about these issues, which I've learned comes from you all also being unafraid of participating in them as well. But what I wonder about is after all of these kind of initial moments of sharing, opening up, being vulnerable with your story, where do you go from there? Because what I've found both within my clients but also just around the country is that men will often have a season where there's a lot of vulnerability, a lot of openness, that maybe they just had a crisis, they hit a breaking point, or maybe they just opened up for the first time. And that season is stunning. The courage to begin to be vulnerable. But then as the years go on, people often default to the same lust management strategies and basically the same strategies that got them into this mess to begin with. And so what I really want to offer you all today is a sense that freedom is indeed possible, but probably not in the way that you would have originally thought. So what I'm going to present today is this kind of counterintuitive, if not radical notion that the particulars of your sexual behavior, the particulars, the specifics of the unwanted sexual behavior that you're participating in actually provides the first set of clues about where to begin your journey. So rather than trying to suppress it or stop it, I'm going to invite you to a counterintuitive path of what it means to listen to your lust. Because the reality of sexual brokenness in our lives is not evidence of a failed existence, it's just evidence of existence. So rather than being sidelined by shame, let's allow shame to not be a barrier to healing, but actually the very bridge to it. So what I'm going to do now is just to kind of give you an overview, and I think you all know this probably better than most crowds, but just to be able to get a sense of, we're going to go 30,000 feet with regard to how prevalent these issues are. What we know from the research is that about a third of all marriages will encounter infidelity at some point in the life of their marriage. In 1 year, on one porn site alone, one site, the world watched 4.6 billion hours of pornography last year. That's the equivalent to over 5,000 centuries worth of porn. Additionally, porn is now one of the best metrics of cultural attention that we have. So essentially, if you want to know what anyone is doing at any given point in time, you need to look no further than Google and some major porn analytics companies. So an example of this is back in 2017, does anybody remember who was in the NBA Finals? Golden State? It wasn't Boston, it was Cleveland Cavaliers. So it's Game 5, and who knows what time of night that is, 9:30? Essentially, porn is down about 6 to 7% in the Cleveland area. And then at some point in the third quarter, it becomes really apparent that Cleveland is going to lose Game 5 and therefore the NBA Finals. And what we see happening is there's a 34% increase in pornography in the Cleveland area, just once they realize that the game is over. I don't know if you all heard about this, but back in January in Hawaii, you know how you can get those emergency alerts on your phone? This is what every resident of Hawaii received, and I quote, "Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill." End of quote. I mean, could you imagine what you're feeling if you get that report right now? So they did porn analytics studies just to say, like, what's everybody doing? And the moment that that happens, porn drops off 77% below normal. Who knows what those other 23% are doing when they're about to die? But then the moment that they realize that there was an error in the system that sent this out, everybody is like, oh my goodness, I'm going to live. But then what happens is pornography shoots up 125%, up to 48% above normal. So I think if there's anything that pornography, infidelity, buying sex is teaching us, is that if we don't know how to regulate our emotions, if we don't know what to do with our boredom and our disappointments, the inevitable outcome is going to be unwanted sexual behavior is going to show up. And so what I think we'll find in just a minute as well is unwanted sexual behavior actually has a lot to tell us about our life, about how our story came to be, and why we've actually come to lean on these things. So my new book, and then I also have an online course that's called The Journey into the Heart of Man. And essentially what these resources are designed to do is to equip the church in a way that we haven't been equipped before to understand what is the why that's driving this. So this isn't a paradigm of strategies and techniques to get away from this stuff. I'm actually going to send you right into the middle of the specific fantasies that you put into Google, right into the very kind of details of why you pursued any given affair. Because what I hope you'll find is that if you want freedom, you have to begin to identify the unique reasons that bring you to it in the first place. So a couple reasons just very briefly about why I wrote this book. The first is that as a mental health therapist, minister, people were arriving in my office with almost no understanding of what freedom had meant. So they had been told to get accountability services on their computer, a lot of filtering software. They had been told to dart their eyes, bounce their eyes, there's a rubber band technique that if you're having a sexual thought or temptation, you just kind of slap a rubber band. And so, as one of my clients recently said to me, he said, "Jay, when I've been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years about the same exact stuff, something's not working with the paradigm that we have set up." And so what I realized is that unless we radically change this conversation, we're going to continue to consign another generation to a lifetime of futility with this issue, and I really don't believe that it needs to be that way. So what I did was I worked with a lot of leading organizations around the country, Covenant Eyes, Fight the New Drug, Faithful and True, Dr. Laser's organization, and we said we want to set out to actually understand what's the why that's driving this. And so what we did is we created a survey of over 100 questions that basically got real intimate with survey respondents. So we wanted to know, what was your relationship with your mom and your dad? What experiences did you live through, whether that was trauma, sexual abuse, bullying? And then what were you dealing with in the present? Like, did you like your job? Did you feel a lot of lack of purpose in life? Were you depressed? Did you have high levels of shame? And then we also asked about the specifics of what people looked for on the internet and what types of affairs and what types of sex that they actually bought. And what I learned is this: there is nothing random about unwanted sexual behavior. Right in the very middle of the behavior that most of us have been trained to stop or to hide, again, are the first set of clues about where we can begin our journey into healing. So to me, this is the most faithful approach to the human heart and to the gospel. So when we look at where God shows up throughout the scriptures, God doesn't show up in places of power. He shows up in the thickness of shame. He shows up in the geography of barrenness. So if we begin to think about just God's approach, even in Genesis, early on in Genesis, what does God say to Adam after he's just eaten of the fruit? Anyone know? Who told you? Yeah, one of the questions that he asks first is, Adam, where are you? What is it that you've done? We see this in Genesis 16 where Hagar, who's just been immensely traumatized, she's been brought in as a concubine to the first family of our faith. And essentially what happens is Sarai, before she's Sarah, Abraham, Abram, and Sarai, Sarai mistreats her. And that word mistreat, a lot of biblical scholars will say that's the same word that the people of Israel, it's the same word for the type of slavery and mistreatment that the people of Israel endured. It also can connote some evidence of a sexual assault. So what we know is the first family was a place of abuse for Hagar. And she goes out into the wilderness where, by all intensive purposes, she's going to die. And it's at that point where the angel of the Lord goes to find her and says two of the best questions that any of us could ever ask, which is, Hagar, where do you come from and where is it that you're going? So to me, if God is curious about how our sorrow and our sin came to be, I think that that's a beautiful invitation for us to be curious about how our sorrow and sin came to be as well. I want to tell you about a client of mine. Of course, details changed. But his name is Scott, and I hope that you see some version of your own story in Scott's. So Scott is 33 years old. He's involved in investment brokerage, and he's been married to his wife for 5 years, and they're expecting their second child in March of next year. He was originally referred to me due to some anxiety that he was having at work from a pretty emotionally abusive boss. And he was also struggling with a fair amount of anger in his marriage that was beginning to have just a lot of debris with his wife and their young child. 2 weeks into therapy, he revealed another significant struggle, the compulsive use of pornography. So during my first 6 months of work with Scott, I learned two pretty significant things about him. The first is that he never wanted to be in the investment brokerage field. Like many of us, he got out of college, had student loan debt, and a friend said, here's an entry-level position, and he stayed ever since. And what he realized pretty quickly is that this field was dominated by men who wanted to make aggressive deals, basically at any cost, in order to retire early. And what Scott noticed is that there was something in his heart that was beginning to care so much less about the things that he once thought he was going to do with his life. And then after the birth of his first child, his marriage basically became sexless. And so there was a lot of anger around just his wife being unavailable, a lot of difficulty, shame that he was experiencing at work. And before too long, he began to go back to pornography at basically the amount of times a week that he used to use it when he was in college. Secondly, is that Scott shared openly and consistently with his accountability partner. Whenever he would get caught, he had a filtering service, and it was always one of those things like, hey, Scott, it's Sunday night around. You usually act out on Sundays. What are you doing? And he's like, yeah, I'm just stressed. Sorry that I did that. Let's follow up in a couple weeks. But what he essentially said to me is that I began to see accountability services almost like fences, that I was always trying to go over and go under in order to find porn. Does that resonate with anybody? So when clients like Scott tell me that they are hooked on pornography, I ask them to share with me the specifics of what they are looking for. And you can imagine Scott's face. This is probably one of the primary reasons that people avoid therapy, is just to not be asked that question. But he essentially said to me, Jay, why is that even important? That feels pretty voyeuristic on your part. What are you doing? And what I told him is that each one of us, every male, every female, has an arousal template, which is basically, it's a constellation of images, thoughts, sensations that sexually arouse us. So that could be a type of pornography, that could be a type of fetish, an article of clothing, some type of business trip. For some of my clients, they can't at some point in their life carry cash in their pocket because that cash becomes a symbol to them of power and that they can kind of just get whatever they want. So what my research showed was that every one of those specific searches and our arousal template has a message to deliver to us about how our unwanted sexual behavior came to be. If we are willing to listen to our lust, our sexual life will have so much to teach us. For Scott, his pornography of choice was something that he felt a lot of shame about. He wanted to see kind of college or teenagers on their knees servicing men in the film. And you could just kind of see he was steeped in shame at this point of just kind of naming that dynamic for the first time. So one of the fascinating things about my research is that we looked at basically a lot of different types of fantasy types. And what we found about men like Scott is that what was all lumped together were men that wanted to see teenagers, college students, a race that suggested to them some level of subservience, a petite body type. What we tended to find was that there were three things that were predictors or key drivers of that sexual fantasy getting developed. And they were a significant lack of purpose, high levels of shame, and having a very rigid or strict father. So if you can see where I'm going, the writing on the wall is that men will often find power over women arousing precisely because of the lack of power that they're experiencing in life. So if you've had a father that has powered over you, that has set you up to be humiliated, that has asked you to be subordinate to him, and you're dealing with a lot of lack of purpose in your life, be that your career or your marriage, one of the primary seductions of pornography is that it's going to give you a world where there's no thorns, there's no thistles, there's no curse that is outlined in Genesis 3. You just get exactly what you want when you want it. And there's nothing like that on the planet. So in therapy, I began to work with Scott on the concept that unwanted sexual fantasy can actually be a roadmap to healing rather than a life sentence to sexual sin. So to do this, I will ask my clients two key questions. The first is to tell me about the time of their first exposure to pornography or the time in their life that they began to lean on it most significantly. The second question is to tell me a significant trauma or traumas that they may have experienced in their childhood. So for Scott, his first exposure to pornography came in the basement of his family home. Does anyone know what a descrambler is? Yeah? Some? So this is basically a device that's used to descramble erotic cable channels. And when Scott was telling me about this and how he first, he used the word discovered porn, he basically used this descrambler device every night after his parents would go to bed. And he said, Jay, I always wish that I had just thrown that descrambler device away. All of the sexual debris, all of the sexual madness that has come to my life, if I had just gotten rid of that, my life would be in a completely different place. And I said, Scott, I agree with you, but who do you think put that descrambler in your home in the first place? And he said, I've never thought about it, but totally my dad. So Scott didn't discover pornography, he was introduced to it. And so what we began to kind of unveil is that the primary cable channels that they would address and the VHS tapes that he also discovered, that was actually his dad's stash, were basically themes involving barely legal teenagers, was so much of what his dad and therefore he became interested in. Second was that one of Scott's formative traumas, came when he was about 12 years old. And what was happening when Scott was 12 is that he told this really stunning story about, very simple but stunning story about him and his brother playing with a Nerf turbo in the family living room. And so his brother would kind of throw a toss, and then Scott would try and catch it on the couch. Scott would pick it up, and then his brother would dive for a catch, and they just kept doing this, and they were laughing. They were roughhousing a little bit, but just having, as he said, like the time of our lives. And meanwhile, his father is down in the basement watching, he said, a football game. I'll buy that for now. But what his father kind of yelled up, he just said, quiet down up there. And they kept playing, and they kept throwing the ball back and forth. And then Scott threw a perfect spiral right into a lampshade and knocked the lampshade over, broke it. And so his father heard all this commotion and just said, I told you guys to freaking quiet down. And he saw that the lampshade was broken, and he said, who did this? And then what he did next was, after Scott said, I threw it, is that he ordered Scott down to his knees. And Scott hesitated, but he felt really powerless under his father's rage, and he got down, and what his father did was took the broken lampshade and bashed it across his head. So what happens to us when we are in the ruts of our unwanted sexual behavior is that the story that's always at the forefront of our minds is our sexual shame and failure. But in many ways, what was happening with Scott's behavior was that his pornography searches and his unwanted sexual behavior was actually the most honest dimension of his life. And I think many of you all in this room can attest to that so many times we try to cover and hide the reality of what's actually happening in our lives, but our sexual behaviors keep getting us in trouble, which is another way of saying it keeps giving us another opportunity to be found. So in therapy, I began to work with Scott on this notion of what it means to listen to his lust, rather than seeing it as something that needed to be annihilated. And Scott was completely undone about the connection between his father forcing him to his knees in the ways that he will be aroused by women being subordinate to him. He began to see that so much of just the economy of pornography and sexual brokenness was really about how do I use someone? How do I exploit someone? And what he realized is that once I'm in a marriage where I feel pretty used, and I'm in a workplace where I feel pretty used, that was basically his realm in pornography, to be able to use someone else. And then also what happened was that he realized that the way that he used to use pornography as a child, basically when he was going to bed, he brought that into his marriage as well. In the same way that he expected pornography to be consistently available to him, he wanted his wife to be available to him in that way as well. And when that didn't happen, there was considerable anger. And so for him, all of these issues around what it means to kind of like bounce your eyes or address your lust or stop your lust actually were far more about issues of his own anger as a man and his entitlement. And because the church has had no language to name anger and entitlement, we cannot therefore invite men to have integrity with those parts of our life, because again, we have no language to name that it even exists. So as you can see, trying to address Scott's unwanted sexual behavior apart from addressing some of the core themes about pornography in his story would never be effective. And so you can kind of begin to see where the course of treatment in many ways splits. And what would happen if Scott wasn't invited into his story was that he would have been set up for the rest of his life to feel like his sexual life was just something that could constantly get him in trouble, that he needed to look over his shoulder at all times. But now he was beginning to say that there's something about his sexual brokenness that has been trying to get his attention for a really long time, to invite him to a more holistic journey of healing than he ever could have imagined. And so what I can assure you about this journey is that this is part of my story as well. This is a lot of the ways that I initially found healing in my own life. I shared a little bit about this with a few guys last night. But I can remember being in a therapist's office, about to be a pastor, a therapist, and saying, I should probably address some of the core themes of my life and pornography before I get licensed, before I become ordained. And so I was really ashamed to talk about sexual fantasies and behaviors that I had been participating in since I was basically in late middle school. And one of the things that she asked me was, she said, Jay, basically tell me a little bit about what you find arousing. What is it that you're actually going for? And again, just one of those reasons to avoid therapy. It's like, I don't want to be in this moment. But what I kind of began to name for her was themes in my life related to fantasies around meeting women's needs. So part of my dynamic is I could walk into a room and see a relationship between a girlfriend and a boyfriend, husband and wife, and just kind of immediately know here's where the brokenness is in their marriage, and this pull to kind of exist for the female in a way that I can be kind, I can listen, I know the themes in your life. I'm a really good reader of vulnerability and pain and the abdication of men. So that wove its way into my fantasy life. It also wove its way into specific porn searches for mother-oriented themes. And she basically just said, and why do you think that's the thing that's seducing you? And so what I was brought back to was a time in college where I was looking at, I was basically on AOL Instant Messenger, if you are young enough to remember that. And this chat window came in, and it was basically this woman that struck up a very innocent conversation and just said, like, you know, I'm having some rough times in my relationship. You want to chat tonight? And so really ambiguous. We started talking. She sent me a very like innocent, wildly beautiful picture of herself. And I kind of bit hook, line, and sinker. I was like, this is exactly what I'm prepared to do, is like listen to what's not going right in your life, see some beauty, get into my own fantasy mind. But then she redirected me to a porn site that she actually managed as well, if it was even her to begin with. And the themes that she introduced me to were, again, mother-oriented themes. That there's so much available on the internet. Most of us have 5 or 6 core things that we can get into. But again, the mother-oriented theme kept coming up for me. And so my therapist, again, began to bring me back to, why do you think it's this thing that is capturing you? And so what I immediately thought about was, I can remember being about 8, 9 years old, sitting at our family dinner table. My dad is a pastor, and small Presbyterian church, people try and get a hold of him at the office, and then they try and call our house phone. So we have an answering machine right next to our table, and this is the beginning of my therapeutic work, is I'm hearing all these stories that are never told on Sunday. Mental illness, kids acting out, pornography issues. On this particular occasion, an elder had just had an affair, and the wife was calling because she was devastated. And I remember watching my dad go into kind of crisis mode of just seeing the wheels turn about what that would mean for his elder board, what that would mean for his life, and then just watching my mom's anger and disappointment rise as well. And so essentially what I was groomed to do in my family, and so much of my gifting as a man, is to be able to kind of say, okay, Dad, you go and attend to all of these things, but I know that I'm going to be around for Mom in the midst of all of her disappointment. I'm going to do more dishes tonight. I'm going to be a very compliant, good boy. And so, again, what my therapist was inviting me into was not just to see my sexual brokenness, because as someone, I forget who named it earlier, it's so, you did, Kurt, so much easier to just list all this debris of sexual behavior and brokenness than to actually go back to some of the most vulnerable moments of our life that actually set all this stuff up. So to be a man, to be able to say, no, this is one of my greatest gifts. And we know from John 10:10 that evil seeks to kill, steal, and destroy. some of the most beautiful dimensions of who we are. So my journey to integrity is not about trying to bounce my eyes. It's about going back to that young boy who learned a style of relating with women that eventually got sexualized. But my point is not to suppress that desire, but it's to be able to say, there's something so stunning about the way that God has made my heart and my eyes, and what does it mean for me to protect that and to not be seduced by things that are going to inevitably lead to what we all know is self-hatred. So to conclude, I'm not asking you all to draw really hard and fast conclusions about basically your unwanted sexual behavior with your past. But what I hoped is that as I talked, there may have been stories that began to populate within your mind. And I would say that those are the things that I would love for you to take into your energy groups and into the conversations. So what I hope you'll find in this journey is that the God of the universe is not ashamed of you. At the height of our sexual brokenness, we might think that God approaches us, maybe shaking his head, wondering when we are going to get our act together. But the reality is this gospel that we follow is that at the height of our sexual brokenness, right in the midst of it, what happens is Jesus comes to us, and Jesus gets down on his knees, and he offers us his body and his blood precisely in the midst of our own brokenness as men. My hope is that through my book and through this course, that you will really get an experience of what it means to be approached by the kindness of God. Because as Romans 2:4 says, do you not know that it is the kindness of God, the curiosity of God, that will lead you to change? Thank you for your time.